Hello everyone, my name is Lucy and I'm one of the reading specialists at the Reading Connection. We're going to continue talking about poetry. In my previous poetry videos, we had talked about parts of a poem, elements of poetry, characteristics of poems, imagery along with visualization, sound devices, figurative language, and today we're going to talk about forms of poetry. There are so many types of poems that it can get fairly easy to get confused. And so in this video, we're going to learn about 6 different types of poems. To help us understand the types or the forms of poetry, I went ahead and made myself another foldable. As you can tell from my other previous videos, I like to do foldables. With this foldable, we have our very first form of poetry here that's called a limerick, okay? And this one's a very fun type of form of poetry. So this one here says that it is a fun form of poetry that usually tells about a person or an animal. It has 5 lines and follows this pattern, line length, and rhymes. Okay, so I can already tell you that usually these kinds of poems are pretty silly. And these letters that we have off to the side over here go back to when we talked about rhyme scheme, okay? So we have the first line and the second line rhyme along with the 5th line here. That's why we have the same letter, A. And then our 3rd and 4th line rhyme together as well, which is why they have the same letter, B. Okay, so basically this poem will have a A pattern. And we also want to make sure that we have a long line, which is roughly about 8 syllables long, a long line again with 8 syllables, a short line and another short line with both 5 syllables, and then it goes back to a long line with 8 syllables. Okay, so how about we read an example of this? And here we have, there was a kitty named Boo who cried when he went to the zoo. He met a big lion who sat down beside him and tried to eat his left shoe. Pretty silly, right? So if you look at it, we have a long line here, another long line, then we have the short line again, and then the very last line is the long one, okay? And we know that we're following this pattern that we have here, okay? Because we have, remember, the first 2 lines rhyme. So here we have boo, zoo, and it looks like the very last line also rhymes with it, okay? So that would be shoe. Do boo, zoo, and shoe rhyme? Yeah, they do. They do rhyme. So we got that right, okay? And if we go back to our 3rd and 4th line, those should rhyme as well. So if we go back to our example, we have lion and him. Okay, so he met a big lion who sat down beside him and tried to eat his left shoe. Okay, so we also have, like we said, the long, short, long sound. The A. The next form of poetry is called a free verse. This is a form of poetry that is probably the least like what you would typically think of when you think of poetry. And so here we have that a free verse is actually a form of poetry that does not follow the patterns, okay? So it does not follow the patterns of rhythm and rhyme, okay? So when we read a free verse, it tends to seem a little unnatural, and a lot of the times you might think this isn't a poem, but it is. There's no law that says that poetry has to rhyme or it has to have rhythm. So poets can do whatever they want. So let's go ahead and take an example, or let's take a look at this example that we have here, which says, snow falls from frozen clouds, white blankets the land. The bears sleep quietly. The birds have gone south because it is winter. Okay, so if you take a good look at it, there is no rhyme, there is no rhythm, because none of these lines really have da 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 to it. There is not a similar line length, so you never get the pattern, and there's no rhyme. And really, there's no alliteration going on in these lines or any kind of sound devices like onomatopoeia or as repetition. So you're missing so much of those things that you would typically hear whenever you hear somebody reading a poem. But that's what makes this type of poetry so unique. Okay, the free verse. The free verse can be pretty cool because you don't have to come up with the best rhymes, and you don't have to come up with the poems that have really good rhythm, which is kind of hard to do sometimes. So free verse is a good option when you're writing a poem and you're not really sure how to follow all those other rules that other poems may have. Our next form of poetry is called a sequein, and a sequein has a form of poetry that has 5 lines and follows this pattern that you see here. Okay, the very first line is going to have one thing, which is a noun. The second line is going to have 2 describing words, which is another word is called an adjective, excuse me. The next line will have 3 verbs. They'll have 3 action verbs. And then the next line will have 1 thought or a phrase. And then the very last line is going to have one thing, which is a synonym to this right here. Okay, now once we look at our example here, this one says oranges, sweet, juicy, peeling, squeezing, squirting, drinking liquid, sunshine, citrus. Okay, so this poem that we just read here follows this pattern, okay? So the very first word that we have is a noun, which is oranges. Then we have sweet, juicy. Well, those are the 2 describing words. The next one is 3 action verbs. Well, peeling, squeezing, and squirting are action words that you can actually do. The 4th line here is 1 thought. Okay, so whoever wrote this poem here was thinking of drinking liquid sunshine. And our last line is just 1 word, and we have the one thing that they placed as citrus, okay, which is the synonym for oranges. So it may seem a lot easier once you have some sort of example to go off of instead of looking at all of this right here, but this is one of the easiest ones to write, and it doesn't rhyme. It doesn't have that rhythm because all of these lines are different syllables, but it does follow this cool pattern here, and it makes it a formulaic, so it makes it pretty easy to write. The next form of poetry is called a haiku, and so this one is actually a Japanese form of poetry that has 3 lines, and it follows this pattern that we see right here. Okay, so it has 5 syllables, 7 syllables, then it goes back to 5 syllables. Okay, so in our example, we have apples crisp and sweet, juices dripping down my chin, yummy fall delight. Okay, so there it is. We have the 5 syllables, then it goes back to 7, and then back to 5. Okay, so with this one here, a haiku is pretty easy one to write. It doesn't have to rhyme, and it doesn't have to have rhythm. You just have to follow this pattern here. Okay, and it's kind of funny coming up with it because you're very much bound to this specific syllable pattern, but this type or this form of poetry can pretty much be cool and fun to write with. Alright, we're moving on to our last form of poetry, and this one is called acrostic. Okay, and an acrostic is a form of poetry where the first letter of each line actually spells out a word. Okay, so when we look over here to our example, I don't know if you can see, but each first letter is actually in a blue color versus the rest of the line. So we can already see that the first letter of each line is spelling a word vertically. So on this case we have C-A-N-D and Y, which is spelling candy. You may have even written one of this or one of these with your name. Each line just started with the next letter in your name. So let me go ahead and read this one to you. This one says, chewy bites, assorted flavors, never enough pieces, delicious and yummy treats. Okay, so the acrostic doesn't have rhyme or rhythm either. It could, but it really doesn't have to. All what it's trying to do or have it do is to spell a word down going this way, and the lines will be describing whatever word you have chosen as the topic of your poem. It just so happens that in this case the word was candy. I hope you have enjoyed this video in learning about the 6 different forms of poetry. If you would like to, you can also create your own poems using this video as a tutorial. Thanks so much for joining me today for this lesson on forms of poetry. See you next time, readers and writers.